Good evening, everyone. The time is 5:01 p.m. and the Belton Independent School District Board of Trustees are now convened in a workshop on Monday, October the 21st, 2024. A quorum of board members is present. Note for the record that we are missing Ms. McDonald and Ms. Lee. This meeting has been duly called and notice of the meeting has been posted in accordance with the Texas Open Meetings Act, Texas Government Code Chapter 551. Any public comments, Becca? None. All right. Moving on to item 3, there being no public comments. You want to take that, Jeff?
I'm just so
I've been on the road. I'm trying to get all the stuff off my phone.
What was it saying? I bet it's something funny.
No.
No, okay.
It's the farmer's report.
Oh, is it? Okay. All right, Dr. Golden.
Board, thank you for being here this evening. I'd like to introduce Bob Templeton. I know that you know Bob. He is with Zonda Education, and he is here this evening to provide us with our fall demographer report.
Well, thank you, Dr. Golden, members of the board. It is my pleasure to be with you. This marks my 23rd year in demographics and planning, and this year I will eclipse 1,600 board meetings that I have attended. And each year I do anywhere from 80 to 100 board meetings a year, and I can tell you this year is presenting with itself with some challenges, and it's challenges in so many areas, so many ways. There's economic challenges related to inflation, the high cost of housing, the interest rates being high. There's the greatest political tension that I've ever seen, and it's affecting education. I was just mentioning before the board meeting, 7-8 years ago, of the 80 board meetings that I would do a year, I would not hear public comment at all. If I did hear public comment, very rarely, it would be very specific to a specific item or something that happened with that particular family. Now it's very common, and it's been common for the last 4 years, and each year has a different theme of challenges. First, when the pandemic happened, it was mask, and it was whether to mask or not to mask, whether to open or close, all those things. And then it transitioned into library books, and it transitioned to bathrooms and gender. Lately, it has been bullying and student threats. That's made up my most recent, what I'm hearing from the public's concern. And this political tension is affecting enrollments. Of our 80 clients in Texas, we've seen soft elementary enrollments at a majority of our fast growth clients. So even our fast growth clients are softening at the elementary grade levels, and it's been primarily kindergarten, first, pre-K. And when I look at the birth rate data, there is some changes in birth rates. I've got 2 millennials, and I'm seeing that within our family and my brother's family and that. But we're also seeing a change in the share of the birth rate. When I say the share of the birth rate, we look historically and we can see what the number of births are in the district, and we measure that against the kindergarten class that's trailing 5 years later. That gives us a ratio. This year's ratio dropped 12%. So we saw a 12% drop in the ratio of kindergartners to birth from 5 years ago. We've never seen anything like that. And so I mentioned that in that this is a very unusual year, but I think it is setting up to become a new norm in terms of homeschool, because the homeschool growth is growing and it's sustaining itself. It has tripled in the last 4 years. Those numbers are hard to quantify because in Texas, they're not required to report to TEA. So therefore, that homeschool number is gathered from interviews with the associations, the Texas Homeschool Associations, and from what we're gathering from the national trends. Now, getting back onto the presentation and economic conditions, the economy is sitting at about 4%, 4.4% for the unemployment rate for the region. You can see Bell County's at about 4.7. You can see that Texas has been at about 4.4, Belton County was at about 5.1, Correll County was at 5, Lampasas County at about 4.3. When you're in that 4 to 5% range, you're still basically fully employed. We are still seeing job growth, so job growth is still happening. Texas is still the fastest growing state in the country for population growth. So we're definitely seeing, overall, I would say cloudy economic conditions. But what makes it cloudy is the high inflation. So inflation is still problematic, and the high cost of housing. Now, the Fed did lower the basis interest rate, the mortgage rate, about 50 basis points a couple of weeks ago. It did have a little bit of an impact. Our economist was on to believe we could see another interest rate drop in December, and if not in December, we could see it in the first quarter of 2025. Now, when we look at total home sales within Belton ISD, you can see it peaked in 2020 when we sold, or we had about 2,800 home sales, and you can see it gradually dropped off. Pretty significant drop in 2023. Year to date, that would be January through August, it was at about 987. Now, this is a function of the cost of housing, the higher interest rates, and it's done two things. It has caused people that are in homes that have mortgages likely took advantage of those really low interest rates, so therefore they're staying put. So we're not seeing as much turn or moving up or moving to different homes because they've likely taken advantage of that really low interest rate. So we're seeing that across all markets. The new home market is performing fairly well because the builders are doing some things to draw those buyers. They're buying down the interest rate, they're offering some upgrades, some discounts, and so they're more aggressive in their marketing patterns to then lure the buyers. So we are seeing a little bit of an increase in the share of home purchases leaning into new homes. Now, when we looked at your projections this year, you came in flat. You really didn't have any growth this year, but the areas that had housing growth, we saw those enrollments grow in those zones, but it was the zones that didn't have any housing, new housing, those were the ones that came in flat or low. Again, the kindergarten across the district was much lower than what we were projecting. Now, the pricing hasn't softened yet. The average price for a new home in Belton, about $394,000. That seems pretty steady increase. The average sale price of an existing home also continuing to go up. So the demand is still strong enough. The supply is a little bit tight, but we've not seen any softening yet in the sale of new and existing homes. Now, here's the map of your district, your elementary attendance zones. Those green shaded areas are the active single-family projects that are happening. We have 53 actively building subdivisions. We have 8 future subdivisions that are in the planning stages. We have groundwork underway on about 340 lots in 3 different subdivisions. Those red outline areas are where we are seeing some new development activity taking place. I'll touch on the highlights here. Of course, North Point is one of your most active areas. They've got 15 homes under construction. They've closed about 52 homes in the last 12 months. That yield of students per home in North Point is 0.602, and there's the satellite image from this past May. And then next to that area, we've got Northgate, 563 total lots, 29 homes under construction. They've got another phase that the groundwork is underway for 93 lots. The yield is very high in Northgate at 0.953. Typically, the yields are in that 0.5 to 0.6 range, so that's yielding much, much higher than what we've seen in some of your other neighborhoods. This is Mesa Ridge. It's over 400 total lots. There were 36 homes under construction. They've closed 79 homes in the last 12 months. That yield is 0.824 students per home. That price point is in the mid to upper $200,000 range. And then we've got a little infill section there. That's the North Ridge Townhomes, 65 townhome lots, 4 townhomes under construction. Anticipate the first residents moving in the first part of 2025. Westfield, it's 1,123 total lots, 9 homes under construction. This neighborhood is yielding about 0.569 students per home. Lake Point Terrace, 686 total lots, 46 homes under construction. They've closed 87 homes in the last 12 months. It's yielding 0.602. So you can see new homes are selling. We are getting new homes occupied. It's just that The overall yield has softened slightly, and that low numbers in those younger grade levels, but this area yielding about 0.602. The Grove at Lakewood Ranch, set 27 future lots, 19 homes under construction. That's yielding 0.714 students per home in the Grove at Lakewood Ranch. We've got the Hills of Westwood, 1,128 total lots. There were 23 homes under construction. They've got 114 lots in phase 14 which are delivered, and they've issued about 34 permits in the last 6 months. It's yielding 0.569 students per home in the Hills of Westwood. And then Fresh Meadows, it's a community of single family for rent. So all the homes will be for rent. It's 263 rental homes. The first homes are under construction. 70 permits have been issued in the last. This rents are renting for $2,000 to $2,300 per month. So pretty expensive, but we do see this product happening in just about every one of our clients. And so it's it's having success. We do see yields that aren't as high as the traditional single-family neighborhoods, but they do yield a little higher than apartments. So they tend to yield in that 0.3 to 0.4 range. Hubbard Branch, 500 total lots, just have one home under construction when we did the research. There is some additional phases that the groundwork is underway. It's a little higher price point at about $340,000 and above. Its current student yield is 0.506 students per home in Hubbard Branch. Three Creeks, 1,500 total lots. It's got about 1,073 occupied homes. They have been building about 100 to 125 homes per year. That area is yielding 0.581 students per home. Wilma Way is a smaller development, 30 lots. There's one home under construction. It's in the mid 300,000. It's in the Tarver Elementary Zone. Hidden Trails, 256 lots, 98 vacant developed lots. They still have some future, they have 155 future lots. They've delivered phase 1, and so home building is likely starting anytime now in Hidden Trails. Another future, this is in the Southwest Elementary Attendance Zone. It's at the edge of the district. 304 future lots. The preliminary plat was approved November of 23. The groundwork is underway. That's the satellite image from August of 24. Just barely inside the district's boundary.
What are those
Proper
houses,
question.
Bob, what are those houses anticipated to sell for?
You know, I'm not sure until we know who the builders are. And so let me go to the overall map so you can see where that is on the overall map. It's that yellow with the red outline as you're getting close to Temple. So it's just barely in the district's boundary. I suspect they'll be building homes next spring, next summer. So they'll likely be starting homes. River Farm, 1,750 future lots. It's a master planned community. I believe there is an elementary site in this development. Anticipate the groundwork starting in 2025, which means that it'll take them a year to year and a half to get the groundwork taken care of, lots delivered. So the reality is it's probably about 2 years before you would start to see occupied homes. But that's a large enough community that it'll likely have multiple builders. It would likely have a similar velocity to what we see in Chisholm.
What exit off I-35 is that close to? Is that, because this grayed out, is that Salado?
Yes,
And
yes. So it's on the edge of the district's boundary as
Okay.
well.
So similar to like the Three Creeks area?
Yes,
Is that what you're
Three
referring
Creeks.
to?
I mentioned
Okay.
Chisholm, but yes, Three Creeks.
Bob, we've seen a lot more anticipated lots in the Hubbard branch area than we did before?
I don't recall
Okay.
if it's more or less than what we.
Because it seems like there's quite a few that, yeah,
Yes.
quite a few lots that are empty
Mhm.
and for future development.
This, in my mind, this could be very pretty, and it's got some nice, it's got some river access around there, and so this could be an interesting development. On the multifamily side, we've got 657 multifamily units under construction across the district, 700 future multifamily units in the planning stages. Of these units, about 100 are age restricted, which will not have an impact on students to the district. The purple shaded areas are the multifamily units that are under construction, and the turquoise are in the planning stage.
I'm sorry, Bob, do you differentiate which are the 55 and older?
I don't recall which one of those are the 55 and
Okay.
older, but there's 100 units of 55 and older.
Okay.
The Cypress Creek Apartments, 180 units have started construction. They started in May of '23. We anticipate they'll start leasing in November, and it'll likely take them several months to get fully leased. Now, this is all of your multifamily across the district. It's a color-coded map based on the yield, and the green are yielding less than 0.25, the yellow are yielding between 0.25 and 0.5, orange are yielding between 0.5 and 0.75, red are yielding greater than 0.75. So you can see a majority are in the green category, yielding less than 0.25. The average yield across the district is 0.214, but you do have some of those that are in orange and red that are in the Hubbard branch and in the southwest zone. Got also one out in the Chisholm Trail zone. Also, these can be mobile home communities. So mobile homes in our database look like it's apartments, even though they're not, but it's the fact that they don't own their spot and it's multiple homes per parcel is why they show up in our database as multifamily. Now, this is looking at the single family and the multifamily yield over time. So this is the average single family yield going all the way back to 2015. I can't believe we've been working with you guys for that long that we have this kind of data, which is great. But you can see the single family yield is staying pretty consistent at about 0.628 students per home, whereas the multifamily yield is actually going down over time. It was about 0.38 back in 2015, and 2024 multifamily yield is at about 0.214. Now this is the geocoded dot map. So these are this year's students geocoded to their addresses. We've got about 530 students that are geocoded outside the district's boundary. That's almost 4% of your students. Then we've got about 27% that live in the city limits of Belton, and about 44% of your students live in the city limits of Temple. So that delta, the difference there would be students that are in the unincorporated county areas of the district. So a little bit more live in Temple than in the city of Belton, and we've got, I'd say, around 500 students coming in from outside the district's boundary. Now, one of the things we do with the data, we do a comparison between this year's student file compared to last year's student file, and we look for new student IDs that were brand new to the district this year. That would be the newcomers, but we don't consider kindergartners as newcomers. They're all newcomers for the most part. So for the newcomers, we're looking at this year's 1st through 12th graders compared to last year's 12th through 11th graders. So of those two groups, we're looking to see new student IDs. And we've done that for the last several years. You can see this year's newcomers was 1,544, but this year's leavers, now leavers are the opposite. So we're looking for missing student IDs that were in last year's database. We saw an increase in the leavers. It went from 1,434 last year to about 1,535 this year. Now I wanted to take a quick look at your enrollment history. So this is a table of enrollment by grade. The yellow shaded cell is the largest grade per year. The green shaded cell is the second largest grade. You'll notice that this year's enrollment came in at 13,704, which was down about 104 students. That number's changing literally every week, so hopefully you're gaining some of that back. But the big change was kindergarten. Last year's kindergarten class was almost 900 students, so we were anticipating this year's kindergarten class was going to be over 900, and it actually came in at 805. So there's a significant difference in the projected number in the enrollment at pre-K, kinder first. Those elementary grade levels are where we did see the biggest softening. Now, the table that's underneath those grade level numbers, that's what's called a cohort change. So the cohorts are simply the change from grade compared to the previous grade and previous year. Look at this year's kindergarten class. It historically had been, about 1 and about 1.2 and 22. This year was 0.896. That's almost an 11% drop in kindergarten this year. So that's not related to the birth rate. That's related to these kindergartners those families have chosen something else. They've either chosen to homeschool or they're going to an alternate source for kindergarten. There are some churches, privates, daycares that do offer some kindergarten opportunities. Kindergarten is not compulsory in Texas, so sometimes we do see that as an option for some. I suspect it's homeschool. I'm seeing homeschool gaining momentum. I attended the homeschool conference in Texas this past year, and it blew me away with what I saw. And it's not about ideology. I thought it was about ideology. When I say ideology, a Christian conservative view that really wants a Christian conservative education. And there is some of that, but of the folks that I interviewed, it was about flexibility. It was the majority wanted a more flexible school day or school time, and they wanted a more flexible school week and a school year. And so these were folks that had flexibility in their work as well. So this flexibility momentum is more than just work from anywhere. It's also, I think, transitioning into education to where the younger families want some of that flexibility. Now, on the demographic side, it was primarily an affluent group that were attending the conference. So these are families that have some flexibility with one of the spouses not working full-time out of the home. So that allows for them to pursue that form of education.
Hey, Bob, let me ask you a question. I'm not sure how to ask this, but, with budget stuff, obviously we rely on you guys a lot, right? So if we were 100 students off, I don't know what that equates to money-wise, it's quite a bit.
It
right?
is.
So when you guys were compiling this information and then giving us this report, looking back on it now, obviously hindsight's 20/20. What happened? Because you guys have been spot on all these years, as long as I've been on this board. So what did you guys not anticipate, or what happened?
The biggest issue was that drop in share of kindergarten.
I understand that, but how was that not anticipated as much?
Well, last year the share was like 0.84. So we assumed it was going to do the same thing this year.
Right.
We didn't assume that it was going to drop 14%.
Right.
And so that was the biggest factor in this year's miss, was the share went from what we saw historically averaging closer to 0.84
Right.
to 0.76.
But there's nothing that happened that you guys didn't anticipate. I know what the numbers show now, but there's nothing that you anticipated?
No.
Looking back on it, like, wait a minute.
Well, no, now, so the projections going forward are using that lower share. So when I show you these projections, it's going to be dramatically different because it is assuming a more, a lower share continuing. Now, there are districts that embrace strategies for how do we get them back? How do we communicate with them? How do we get that back?
Yeah.
but the biggest area was at the younger grade levels. Now, the other thing that was interesting is when you look at, there were campuses that came spot on, that actually came in even a little above our forecast. So it's not that every campus was under. No, we had campuses that were on and a little over. The secondary campuses, good. The middle schools and the high schools, very close. So this is an elementary issue primarily, not a district-wide issue. Now, this is the low scenario. This is what I would call a very conservative, but with the upcoming legislative session likely going to advance vouchers, I think it is paramount that we start showing you 2 scenarios going forward. So we're now doing this for all of our clients. And I think when we look at the reality, it's going to likely fall somewhere in between. There may be a year where it floats closer to the mid, most likely. There may be a year like this year where it hits the low number. But under a low scenario, you can see we're being very conservative for the next 5 years. Your enrollment would get to about 13,779 students in 5 years. I would describe it as basically flat. And then you can see it picks up and starts to grow a little bit in the back half of this forecast. What does this do at the campus level? Well, it could mean that we really don't have any pressure at our elementary campuses until we get out about 7 to 8 years. It would be Hubbard Branch and it would be Chisholm Trail. Those would be the 2 campuses that could approach capacity in about 7 to 8 years. You'll also notice, you can see, you've got Leon Heights. Now that's an older building, much smaller building in terms of capacity. But when the enrollments get down to that level, it becomes inefficient and it becomes somewhat problematic. Now, we are working with about 7 school districts right now that are considering closing schools because their numbers get into a spot where it's inefficient and hard to operate. I don't know if that's where that is for Leon Heights, but that one does jump out at me, and it did come in pretty significantly under what we forecasted. At the secondary level, you can see North Belton Middle School, it is at capacity and it exceeds capacity. You can also see Lake Belton High School floats up toward capacity. So the green is when they get within 5% of capacity. There's a little more flexibility at secondary campuses to handle those numbers. There's not any flexibility at elementary campuses. But so it's that north part of your school district that's seeing the pressure at North Belton Middle School and Lake Belton High School. Now, this is assuming things get a little bit more back to normal. It does still assume a lower kindergarten ratio, but if we see stronger growth at the elementary grade levels, then in 5 years we could be at about 14,485 students, and in 10 years we could be at about 15,736 students. You can see when we look at it at the campus level, it moves up everything at Hubbard Branch and at Chisholm Trail, Hubbard Branch. It moves them up a little bit to where they could be approaching capacity in about 6 to 7 years. At the secondary level, again, North Belton Middle School and Lake Belton High School, it just pushes everything up.
So what do you base the new tech projections on? Right? Since
We
it's 5 to 10
basically
years.
hold it. We just hold it.
Okay.
And they came in under this year, so but the number we were using was basically what they had the previous year.
Bob, what's interesting is your other slides that show all of the lots and all of the housing. That tells a story of growth.
Yes.
But on here, you're showing a pretty flat, slight growth increase over time.
Mm-hmm.
So can you help us make sense of that? Because it does feel like the other slides don't tell that story.
Right. This slide is closer to matching up with that story. because it does show that you're growing from 13,700 to 15,700. So it's grown about 2,000 kids in 10 years. I think the low scenario is because of what I'm seeing with enrollments across the state with our clients, with our fast growth clients. So this softening didn't just happen in Belton. It's happened in Eagle Mountain, Saginaw. It's happening in several districts that they look like fast growth, but yet this year didn't really happen. And again, I think that the challenge is the kids are here. They're just, families are choosing to either homeschool. I'm not seeing a big private school. They don't have the capacity to take on these kinds of numbers. So it really feels like it's a homeschool issue. Now, we are leaning into studying some new technologies that we think will help us to answer some of these questions that we'll likely have available in the springtime. So we're researching ways to try to figure out where the leavers and where those that we think are here, where are they going?
So you anticipate vouchers will happen?
Yes.
Right, okay. So let's assume that for a second. What's the projected number of students that would take advantage of that here at the BISD?
Well, that would fit where the low scenario. So I'm basing my low scenario on what could be worst case. If
How many, what would be the number in your mind?
it could be a 2% impact, 2 to 3%.
Do the private schools, other schools have the capacity for
No.
that?
I think it'll take time. So I think there will be a buildup of awareness that some of these privates and churches and these groups will eventually. Some of these really large churches are already in a facility position. Many of them have gymnasiums. They have large commercial kitchens. They have some classroom space. So then for them to add an education program will take a little time, but it won't be like they're starting from scratch. So I think when the vouchers are passed, it could be a 2 to 3 year buildup of the feeling the effects of that. And the reason I think it's going to happen is because my representative that I supported in the Waco area, You Shine, he was a Republican that was pro-public schools, and Governor Abbott's candidate won the primary. And so Governor Abbott believes he has the votes now to get the voucher passed. Now, should there be a change in the November election, it's certainly.
So I want to go back to something Manuel said on, yes, we bring budget assumptions to the board as we're preparing budgets for the next year. And so you can see when you see the slide where we had the significant 5.7% growth and then 3%, 2%, you know, we are building assumptions based on this data. And so on the one hand, the more conservative low projection, the consequence of it coming in higher than that is we're hiring teachers at a time where the applicant pool is going to be low. The school is starting. You overstaff because you go with the higher projection, and then you have smaller class sizes, but you have additional staff that technically are not fitting our funding formula or our pupil-teacher ratio formula. And so that's the challenge we're balancing in using these numbers, but that's what we use when we make assumptions in budget. So that's when we're a little overstaffed or when you're a little understaffed, depending on how those numbers come in. So.
In the past, when we saw these kinds of swings, we would usually be able to spot it with housing trends. The housing slowed down. Here, the housing is still performing at a level that should have produced kids. We know there's enough construction, enough closed homes, enough activity that we should have seen some growth this year. So this year's function goes back to, in my mind, it is a direct tie to this increased number of leavers here, because we normally see the separation between the new and the newcomers and the leavers. We normally have a healthy separation there, and this year we didn't. We didn't have a separation there. We had it equal to the amount of newcomers and leavers was almost the same.
Do we, it's gonna be a long question, but y'all operate in many states. Texas is somewhat not completely new to homeschooling, but it hadn't been that big of a deal until the last several years. Are there other states that it has been real prominent? And I guess my question to that is, my concern is, how many of these are homeschooling, say, K through 5, K through 6, and then you see an influx in your secondary schools that there's no way to be prepared for because you didn't see the numbers coming up from kindergarten? I mean, if they start in homeschool, do they typically stay there? Do you know what the data says on that?
We are studying the data on that. We do think, when I did my interviews with the families this past summer, I asked the question, are you planning to homeschool your kids all the way through graduation? Very few of them had thought that far. Most of them were really thinking in terms of the next 1 to 2 years. And these were elementary. Now, I suspect that we will see a return of the homeschool because the content becomes more challenging. It's one thing to be homeschooling elementary where your field trip is going to the zoo and a park and you've got that kind of engagement. As they move into middle school, there's also the peer pressure, the desire for fine arts and for athletics moves up into a higher priority. So I think we will see a cohort change in middle schools coming back to public ed. And it will be hard to really nail down how that's going to look.
So you said, to make sure I understand, you said that was a function of flexibility, not ideology.
Now, there was ideology, but to my surprise, it was more about flexibility. It was, several of them commented to me, if we go to the public school, our day has to start at 6 in the morning in order to get up, get ready, get to school by 7:45. And so if I homeschool, now my day starts whenever I want it, and there's not that prep time. Also, their day ends earlier, and they wanted to have that flexibility about not just a 4-day. No, they only wanted to go maybe 3 days, or maybe, and it would change based on how the family schedule changed. But it was more about flexibility in the schedule.
And that came through your interviews or your questions, just people that were, the families that were attending that conference?
Yes. So I went to, they had like 3 days of sessions. So I attended every session that I could attend, and I interviewed 2 to 3 families at each session.
Okay.
Many of them had multiple kids. The other thing that was at play, they had multiple kids, so there was the logistics of that, of trying to get multiple kids to different locations, led them to go with a homeschool route for ease.
Think about when COVID hit in 2020, is that right?
Yes.
So our kindergartners coming in, so think about that's the time period in which they're being born.
Yes.
So,
So, Bob, what's our yield, if you just looked at across the entire district, what's the student yield for the district as a whole? Do you know?
Well, that's where that single family yield is 0.6.
Right.
6, and so.
So if I were to like generalize, I would use 0.6 across
Yes.
the district. So when I look at like this, I'm back on slide 3, so when I look at the 2022 to 2023 drop, right, so that's 668 homes. So that's potentially 400 kids.
Should have been. Now, this is total home sales. So
Right.
some of these homes had kids in them before, so you can't just, but, a portion of that is new homes.
Oh,
So, if we're building, say, 500 homes, based on our yield, we ought to be growing 250 to 300 kids.
Do you think, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead, Chris.
On those qualitative interviews with families, what was the total sample size? You said 2 to 3 per
Well,
session.
I know there were 7,000 families in attendance at the conference. The conference sizes would vary. It'd be anywhere from a dozen to, I went to a couple that were in like the ballroom that had 150 individuals.
Okay. Do
But
you have a total number you think
Well, I interviewed, like I said, I was there 2.5 days. I attended a dozen sessions, so it was easily 30 to 40 families. And it was, have you ever attended public schools? You know, the majority of them had not. And so these were really young families that were just starting their education journey. But the thing that I think has happened is the technologies, the resources that have advanced for online learning, and for they had a trade show that looked as almost half as big as the midwinter trade show. There were easily a couple of hundred vendors, and they were buying right there on the spot. But it was all kinds of curriculum. I came across at least 3 different teacher groups that were former public ed teachers that were now in the business of mentoring and tutoring, and they loved this new life because they were working 3 days a week. They had partnered with the church, so they had a location that they didn't have to pay for rent, and they provided drive-in tutoring for math, science, and reading, and I was blown away. It was at the Kalahari Resort in Round Rock, and I don't know if you're familiar with that. It was full, completely full of homeschool parents.
Do we have another slide, Bob? I don't
The
know.
key takeaways, I don't know if I got through the key takeaways.
Do you have a question? Oh, you said there was one more. Got it.
So Belton's enrollment decreased by 104 students this year. Kindergarten class this year, much lower than it's been in the last 5 years. Based on the current sales, Belton ISD is forecasted to close about 1,480 homes by the end of the year. The district has 8 future subdivisions with over 4,950 lots in the planning stages, so we're still seeing very healthy development of new projects. We've got groundwork underway on about 340 lots, which will be delivered within about 3 subdivisions. We expect the Belton's enrollment will be in a range of between 13,700 students, between about 14,400 students in 5 years. This range is going to vary depending upon what happens with vouchers and what happens with this next legislative session. In 10 years, it could be at about 14,400 and about 15,700. We recognize that we've got to learn and grow and change, and so that's why we're leaning into new data and new ways to track mobility and to track where these kids are choosing to go. The one piece that we won't be able to really track down is the homeschool piece. We are hopeful that in this next legislative session, I don't know if you've been familiar with the Fast Growth Coalition's legislative objectives. Several of those are related to charter schools, but one of those is also related to homeschooling. So if we could get if homeschooling notifying to TEA, that would really help us with being able to understand what's happening within school districts related to homeschooling.
Board, do you have any questions for Bob? Or any additional questions?
I do. So I've heard on more than one occasion, just in the conversation around vouchers, that the market for private schools is potentially going to go up, because if some private schools are at capacity and they can't take more because of space, then it may create new opportunities for other schools to open. In your study of our district, I know you know where all of our schools are. Do we even have within our district lines, are there enough private schools to even, I don't even know if I'm asking that right, but I know of a few within our district, but do you see that there is a large enough market even in our district? If we were to lose, if we were to project more on that low slideshow on numbers.
I believe that it's a demographic factor related to affluency. So the more affluent an area is, the more vulnerable it will be to private school choice. For urban school districts that have a higher percentage of economically disadvantaged students, they're not going to be vulnerable to private school. Now, they could be vulnerable to charter schools because those areas, majority of those parents likely working on-site in physical locations. So if they're having to go to a work site, they're not a candidate for homeschool. And so this area does have some affluent areas that could could seek private school. They could be attracted to homeschool or private school. Now, that'll take time because there's not necessarily a large amount of private school space available, but there are also privates that they don't want to grow.
Right.
They're very settled with their number and their enrollment, and those are mostly in the urban areas as well. Those are the very high affluency areas that there's not going to be expanding of St. Mark's or St. Day and those privates in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. It'll likely stay that same level. Now, a voucher for those families would offset some of that cost, and they might just raise the tuition to match it. It'll be something that we'll have to learn when the legislative session gets that decision settled and we see what's going to be the voucher, what's it going to look like. Then we'll know more about what the outlook could be.
Other questions?
If you think of additional questions, don't hesitate to send them later on. I do think this is a big year. I think this is the most unsettled I've seen public ed in terms of political tension that I can remember.
So that's why we focus on what we can control, and what we can control and focus on are the outcomes for the students in Belton ISD. And we have incredible teachers and staff working really hard. I get to see that in classrooms every week when I'm in them across the district. And so we're keeping our focus on our improvement efforts, our improvement plans, and the strategic direction that y'all set. And so we're just keeping our eyes focused on how do we just get better and better as a school system every day on behalf of our students and our staff. And so we appreciate you, Bob, being here. Thank you for the update.
Thank you, Bob.
You're welcome.
Well, that concludes our board workshop this meeting. There being no further business, we are adjourned at 5:49 p.m.